Hello, everybody. Welcome to the start of the finale of this festival. One could say thank you for your introduction, Christoph. Um, Klaus K. Hüblers short cello solo, Opus Breve, composed in 1987, is only 11 bars long, around 1.5 minute playing time, but of staggering complexity. As an example, I just show you the first bar of this piece. On first glance, it looks like a very complex and nuanced traditional musical score, a descriptive notation which notates the sounds which the performer should produce. But on closer look, there are in fact almost non-specifications about the demanded actions, about the demanded sounds, but very nuanced instructions about the actions one has to perform, an action score in disguise, so to speak. It is in its detailed and nuanced nature and its focus on the performative tasks. The score of Opus Breve is similar to many scores of the so-called new complexity. One could argue now that in Opus Breve and in many new complexity works, there's almost no room for interpretation. It is just a matter of executing the highly demanding performative tasks as perfect as possible. In this sense, Opus Breve seems quite the opposite of the music discussed mainly here at this Congress. It is not a game score. The performer is not left with many decisions to make or different paths to go. It is not an open work or one that evolves with every performance, an ergodic score or something like that. And although Opus Breve seems competitive in its performative demand, the learning and the performance of the Opus Breve has little to do with goal-oriented strategy against or with other players, rule-based decision-making, or even fun, notions often affiliated with the concept of a game. However, Ellen and I would argue that Opus Breve can actually be understood as a performative and musical game, a game for which the overcomplex score is the foundation for the gameplay, and the performer interacts on this space with, as we will see, a perhaps unsuspected counterpart, the cello itself, and that this perspective helps also in learning to play this very difficult piece. To explicate this interpretation furthermore, I will first introduce the German composer Klaus K. Hübler and his special notation style, which is sometimes called parametric polyphony. Then I will present a short analysis of the work, and after that Ellen will explain her approach to interpret the game, which is informed by game theory, game approaches, and by the performance practice of new complexity. My analysis and Ellen's performative reading of the piece will serve then as a starting point for our interpretation of Opus Breve as a game. So, Klaus K. Hübler was a German composer born in 1956 in Munich. He studied with Brian Ferneyhough, and he was in the 80s very up and coming and demanded, and also got the Kranichsteiner Musikpreis at Darmstadt in 1988. Around 1980, he developed this special notational style, which is very closely linked to his compositional concerns. First in the piece Feuerzauber, auch Augenmusik from 1981. It's for three flutes, harp, and violoncello. He decoupled the different playing parameters of the instruments for the first time. This decoupling of the different playing parameters is sometimes called parametric polyphony, a term coined by the composer and Hübler expert Wieland Hobban. The term parameter refers in this case to the different performative parameters, not the musical ones. The actions one need to fulfill to play an instrument were in fact the material with Hübler composed with. This focus on the playing parameters stemmed from his general compositional approach, as he told in an interview in 1987, the same year he composed Opus Breve. You have to study the sound production of the instrument you use in detail beforehand, and that is of course time-consuming. But that's what I find attractive. In addition to the compositional resistance, there is also the instrumental resistance, and you have to fight against both. On the other hand, I believe that the instruments can then reveal their spirit. You look at the instrument until it reveals its spirit, so to speak, and opens up possibilities that belong to it alone. His approach to composition and the instrument emanated from a critical examination of the instrument and promoted an expansion of sound and technique that has its root in the history and the specific resources of the instrument and its manner of performance. So I will come to a short analysis of the work. I want to focus now on the performative aspects. How does the piece as a cello solo work? How the different playing parameters and the sonic result interact with each other, and what, in consequence, could be seen as the main topic or for a performance of Opus breve. Ellen Fallowfield will play the piece now once without the score. Then I will explain the functioning of the score to come to, in my opinion, the central topic of the work. Ellen will play the piece once more with the score at the very end of our presentation. As in Feuerzauber, we have multiple staffs for one instrument and ergo a decoupling of the different playing parameters. On the lowest staff, we have the placement of the fingers of the left hand. In the middle staff, the 4 strings of the middle staff represent the 4 strings of the cello, and the upper staff is for the back and forth motion of the bow. Additional, as you see, these 3 aspects of the playing of the instruments are often not synchronized. The change of finger of the left hand happens independently of the bowing of the right hand and of the change of strings. Additional to these 3 parameters, there are more playing aspects annotated. The dynamic specifications, which are under or above every staff, are not for the volume of the sonic result, but they refer to the intensity of the action. For the low staff, this is the intensity of the finger attack. For the middle staff, it's the intensity of the bow pressure, and for the upper staff, it's the speed of the bow motion. And then there are more playing instructions. First, which part of the bow to use, that is FR for am Frosch, at the nut, M, middle of the bow, SP for Spitze, tip of the bow. Second, where to bow on the strings, so sul ponticello, loco ordinario, or sul tasto, and then bow at the bowing technique. This is arco ordinario or collegno. That means we have 2 parameters for the left hand and 7 parameters for the right hand. Left hand is placement of the fingers and finger pressure, and right hand is string change, also on which string to bow, intensity of bow pressure, direction of the bow, bow speed, bowing location on the bow, bowing location on the strings, and bowing technique. And these 9 parameters serve as compositional material for Hübler, and he composed with them in a very polyphonic way. These 9 parameters also interact as a kind of filter. We will now come to a hands-on example of this filtering process. Here you see the 5th bar of Opus breve. Ellen will play this bar now 3 times. First, she will play only the lowest stuff, with traditional and bowing technique, so that you hear as much as possible of the fingering of the left hand. Then she will play all three stuffs together, but without any of the further playing instructions like arco battuto, etc. And third, she will play everything together as perfect as possible. The sonic result of those different layers of the performative actions is in fact contingent. If we take, for example, the marked spot here in red, the left hand stops the notes B and A, and in between those two does a finger tremolo on the notes E and F. Additionally, one has to do a glissando from F to F sharp and from B to C sharp. The right hand has now 4 short arco battutos event on the G and the A string. So for the G string, it's not clear where between this B and the C sharp those 3 arco battuto hits will come down, and additionally, it's not clear if the arco battuto hits will coincide with the E or the F of the finger tremolo. So the sonic result is not clear for every performance, it's contingent. As a general impression, those filtering processes result in a sonic instability, in my opinion, the main topic of the piece. You hear almost never a clean produced cello sound. It is always in one way or the other unstable, fragile and ephemeral. If we turn to the last bars of the piece, here in bar 7 to 11 you see 3 main motifs of the piece juxtaposed in blocks. In red, accents, often with multiple stops where the left and the right hand is coordinated, a very rare occasion in the whole piece. In green and blue, oscillation movements on the string without any bow movement, combined with multiple stops which are loaded with finger tremolo, glissandi and harmonics. Especially in bars 7, 9 and 11, one could get the image that we reached a kind of stability. The hand coordination is established, the stop notes are very clearly audible, etc. But if we look closer, this image turns out to be an illusion, which gets very clear in bar 11. So there's still a lot of filtering going on, so to speak. Within these multiple stops, a lot of little variations and flux is going on, which makes these final sounds very ephemeral and produce a kind of morendo effect. We have the indication to play extremely sul ponticello, together with a high bow speed, which produces a kind of flautando effect. Then we have the bow pressure, which is within the single multiple stops very different from string to string, especially at the beginning of the bar. This bow pressure declines gradually over the course of the bar, and at the end it's almost no bow pressure. And then we have the density and the ambitus of the single sounds. Those vary a lot between the quadruple stop in the middle register at the beginning to the single note in the lower register in the mid towards the end of the bar to the double stop in the very high register at the end. So also at the end, the sonic result is one of great instability, and even here in the seemingly stable sounds, the sonic instability and the filtering processes are still dominating the musical texture.
Great, thanks, Jaronas. So I'll take over, and Jaronas and I discussed this piece a lot together, obviously, but I'll take over now and discuss how I use this kind of game idea to work towards an interpretation. I guess I just pressed this. Oh, I do. Okay, so I was pleased to have this idea of working with the concept of a game and trying to work out how that could have influenced how I learned the piece and how I played the piece. So my first step in this kind of adventure was to decide what are the components of a game for myself. So I decided that there has to be some kind of rules of play. There has to be some competitors or some players, which would indicate maybe a winner or at least an outcome. And then I thought, okay, it has to be kind of fun somehow, which is maybe, if you look at the score, not the first thing that you think. But I thought, well, bonus, like if I can find a way of trying to find some fun in the score, then that's, quite a nice side product. So the aim was to kind of find a game approach to inform this interpretation process. So back to my game elements, the first one being rules of play. I decided that the first rules of play for this game is the legend and the score. Well, the legend pretty much looks like a long list of rules. As you heard from Jaronas, 9 parameters here, 3 here. So far, so good. And the score itself is also very instructive. So as Jaronas mentioned, there's a kind of ambiguity in the score. It's basically a descriptive score, which is how we described it. It's an action score described as a descriptive score. So it looks like it's describing things that we talk about musically, like dynamics and stuff, but actually it's describing bow pressure and bow speed. So being an action score, it is basically a kind of instruction. And Hübler actually said about this score, he said, about his music in general, my compositions never exceed the technical possibilities of the instruments. And he said if they did once, then that would be a mistake that he'd made. So he really tries to be inside what's possible on the instrument. Which follows this idea of having a rule, something that is within a limit, something that's achievable, something that's possible, pretty much exactly. But of course the picture's more complicated. The other idea of rules of play that we have as performers is performance practice conventions. And my performance colleagues in Baroque music or Renaissance music, they also have these performance practice conventions. And for contemporary music, we're solidifying certain performance practice conventions. And I wanted to ask, what are the performance practice conventions of new complexity? And of course, new complexity is here in little speech marks, because the composers who write new complexity don't like this term at all, but it is actually quite useful for us. So of course, this is a whole lecture in itself, but I looked at a few performers who I really admire, who wrote quite generously about how they approach this kind of music. One is Stephen Schick, who's an excellent percussionist, and he wrote about Bone Alphabet, which is a piece written for him by Fernie Howe. And he wrote really specific ideas about how he learned, tips about how he learned it. Like he printed out one bar, really huge, and transferred it onto graph paper so that he could get the rhythms right, and he practiced in this quite specific way. And his theory is that you really have to slow down what he calls the soft phase of learning. So for him, that's the middle phase, when you've looked at the score, you kind of know what you want to do, but now you're trying to put the score into your body. So he's like, if you do this as slow as possible, this is how you can create like a reliable performance of the piece that doesn't abandon you when you actually get on stage with it. And he also mentioned that you have this plasticity that you gain from repeated performances of the piece. As you play it again and again, it kind of you get more plastic, and you're able to have a bit of freedom in the piece. Ian Pace, an excellent pianist, he wrote about a prioritization that he makes when he concentrates on different aspects of the piece at different stages of the learning experience. So he might just try really hard to get the rhythm right and forget everything else once, then focus on some kind of other expression, and work strategically like that through the piece. And he also mentions balancing positivistic, so a really detailed approach, with a structural approach. So having a good structural overview of the piece versus working inside a bar for a long time. Frank Cox, who's a cellist who's recorded this piece, he takes a much more hardline approach. So he talks about morally responsible performances of the piece. So he says there has to be a very, very strong link between notation, realization, and reception. So it's very clear, very stable. And a colleague, an excellent cello colleague, Tanja Orning, based in Norway, she's also recorded the piece a few times and written about it. And she talks about ethics. So there's a difference between morals and ethics. And she says anyway, the idea of someone who's trained in this Werktreue world, approaching new complexity, it has a kind of ethical issue at the center of it, because you're trained to have this score as the kind of god of what you're playing, and you have to try and achieve it as much as possible. And so she says that what's needed is a kind of replacement for this Werktreue approach to interpretation. And she finds a new learning model that's based on what's possible in the body, what the instrument can do, and also the performer's ability then to critically assess what they're doing in the process. And as she mentions, which I think is really valid, it's consistent with how the composers talk about it. So Barrett talks about his notation as a proposal, and Ferneyhough mentions very often meaningful inexactitude. So if it's inexact, then it has to be in some kind of meaningful way. And keywords that came up in this kind of discussion again and again are expression and freedom. So how can you put expression in this music, and where's the performer freedom? And I'll come back to them a bit later, but I just wanted to plant those words out there already. So in the game model, I'm now looking at players and competitors. And I think the first kind of team of players in this piece, or an important team of players in this piece, is the performer, the score, and the instrument. Oh, I should have tried this, sorry. Hübler wrote about this polyphonic production, which you can see on the 3 lines. So you have the 3 different types of techniques on the 3 lines. And later, of course, Cassidy and Barrett and Co. called this parameterization and decoupling, but in the 80s, no one was using those terms yet. But when Hübler writes about this polyphonic production, he says that he's aiming to expand sound and technique. And he puts the word sound first. And I think that's something I really held on to, because in contrast to this idea about a list of rules, when it really looks like he's starting from the technique and working out, it seems like the resulting sound was actually really important to him. And his idea was to find a way of expanding sound in an interesting way. So that for me was really important. And of course, the result of this polyphonic production is that the cellist is working against their technical reflexes and against the intuition, or the learned intuition that they've worked on for 15, 20, however many years. But there's a kind of contradiction, because it's also absolutely fitting to the instrument. So like Hübler said, there's nothing, or in theory, there's nothing that's outside of what's possible on the instrument. And Barrett came up with a good term for this about a decade or so later, which is radically idiomatic instrumentation. So something that's purely idiomatic, but in a kind of radical way. But of course, it's idiomatic for the instrument, but it's not idiomatic for the instrumentalist, so the player. So there's a kind of tension there. So it requires some kind of relearning on the part of the cello. You have to relearn not to coordinate your right and left hands. But also, because realistically that's not really possible, there will always be a kind of tension in the score, or a tension in the performance, where you're actively trying to work against something that you've learned. And I imagine that that's some kind of tension which could maybe be expressive, that's kind of built into the score. And also there's simply things like the speed of your muscle response to have these 4 different pressures on a chord with 4 pitches in it, that's just pushed to such an upper limit that there's also this kind of residual tension there that I think might be somewhere where this expression might lie. So maybe there's an expression in movement in the piece. And in terms of freedom, sometimes people talk about these pieces as musical choice of the part of the interpreter being sort of bounded by the upper limit of the possibility of the techniques in the score. So basically, you say, okay, this is too much for me, what do I leave out? And for me, I'm really not satisfied with that idea of my interpretive freedom being based on what's possible from the score. It seems like in terms of the games analogy, let's say, the performer is always then a loser. It's just a question of to what extent you're a loser, because you can never fulfill everything, and then you just make choices, compromises, and bound it somehow, technically. And for me, that's not a very fun or exciting interpretation of what interpretive freedom is. So I decided we had to keep looking. So in terms of players and competitors, my next group is musical material at play. And I think here we can find both expression and freedom. So just an overview, when you take a first glance at the score, you see these three staves, and you see this kind of filtering system built into the score. You see this very busy left hand, and it's almost like the right hand is a piece of paper placed over this left hand with some holes in it that's made by the actions in the right hand, and it just lets you view what's underneath the holes, and everything else is kind of concealed in this filtering system. So there, I think there's some expression. You also see bar lines. He chose to put bar lines in. He chose a meter. He chose some kind of phrasing, and he's chosen this rhythmic play. That also has to have a kind of important quality in a performance. And you can also see these horizontal and the vertical lines, which Orning described as architectural, which I think is really a beautiful way of describing them, that these are kind of marking points on the score, and that must be interpretively or expressively something important contained in the score, because just when you look at it as an object, the score, they kind of jump out at you. So I decided, okay, there must be a kind of narrative in there. What can we find? What kind of stories are hidden in the score? And I've just prepared 3 kind of narratives of the score for you. The first one is this polyphony versus monophony. So you can see the 3 polyphonal lines, and you can see when the right hand is coordinated with the left hand, you have these very long staves, tails on the notes that he writes, and you can they go over the 3 staves, and I've marked them yellow. And when 2 lines are coordinated, so when the right hand pressure is coordinated with the right hand speed and this kind of thing, I've marked that blue. He writes that with slightly longer tails as well that go over 2 lines. And then all the rest of it is polyphonic, so it's working against each other. So here you can kind of see the story in the piece between polyphony and monophony, that you can see there's a kind of tessellation between the 3 things, then it kind of breaks apart, and it's a very polyphonic section, then really a purely polyphonic bar, and then it turns more from tessellations into these juxtaposed blocks. So that's one kind of story. Okay, what does that mean as an interpreter? It means that you might choose to take a bit more time to play these yellow chords in the first bar because they're important. Or it might mean that you choose to, when you're practicing the piece, just play the yellow chords or something like that. It has an impact then on how you learn, how you perform. And another aspect for me is this dynamic coordination. So as Jaronas mentioned, these dynamic levels usually refer in the upper 2 lines to bow speed and bow pressure, but occasionally Hübler puts a big, bold font dynamic, which means real actual dynamic. And so I wanted to map those out and see where they come. And they come in the first of these big chords, and then there also are a few piano dynamics that come again and again, or well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And so here you can see that there's a kind of reduction in this dynamic coordination as the score goes on. So game analogy, the winner is the lack of coordination dynamically, let's say. There's a kind of takeover of this uncoordinated dynamic as the score goes on. And again, what does that mean as an interpreter? It means something that you might throw away technically actually might take on a different kind of significance. So you might think, oh, actually this piano staccato actually would be important to articulate quite clearly somehow because it's part of this story of dynamic coordination. And another important aspect in this story of the score is these oscillation sounds. So Jaronas and I identified quite early the importance of these oscillatory sounds, this digga-digga-digga-digga back and forth. You have it in the left hand, tapping. You have tremolos in the right hand. You have going back and forth over several strings in the right hand. And you also have going back between the bow hair and the bow stick in the right hand. So I marked all of these in green, and you can also see a kind of pattern, a kind of story of the piece here, that there's a kind of dialogue between 2 where different oscillations are played at the same time. Then there's a kind of parallel dialogues, and then there's some one after the other kind of dialogues, and then there's an intensification, and this is in these bars where there's lack of coordination, there's a big intensification of this oscillation material, and then there's a kind of disintegration of the oscillation material. So those are 3 kind of stories that I extracted from the piece that I think, using this game approach, enable me or someone to put some kind of expression and some kind of freedom of interpretation into a piece which at first glance might look quite hard and kind of restrictive. basically.
So what do we do with those two findings in a way? What's our interpretation? So to sum that up, the score of Opus Breve is an action score. It's a kind of gameplay which defines a very strict and detailed set of rules. And different narrative threads are embedded into this gameplay, which the performer could work with and can carve out. The performer then interacts according to this set of rules with the cello and reacts to the sonic and haptic responses of the instrument itself to tell the stories of the piece, so to speak. The performer enters a dialogue with the instrument, and this dialogue is quite different than the conventional interaction between performer and instrument. The different results from the unusual notation, an action score in disguise and not a sonic notation, and the decoupling of the performative parameters. The performer has to relearn then in a way the instrument to a certain degree. And because Opus Breve is an action score which consists of different filtering layers, the sonic result of the performative actions is contingent. That means that the performer has to react to the sonic answers of the cello in order to fulfill the goal in real time. It's not really plannable. And this produces then the sonic instability, and which is the main topic of the piece and of the should be of the performance. The game Opus Breve is then written for two players, a performer and a cello. The goal is to produce the sonic instability and flux, which we would argue is the central topic of the piece. In order to achieve this goal, the performer has to fulfill the actions written down in the score, but the emphasis is on the different layers of the performative tasks and how to balance the different narrative threads into the performance. They change according to the sonic responses of player 2, the cello. And this cello, this instrument, presents itself suddenly as a capricious and volatile agent to the performer. Seen this way, Opus Breve presents Opus Breve presents itself not as a very detailed and constricting score with a little freedom as possible for the performer, but as a space full of possibilities, a typical game notion, which requires a balanced, attentive dialogue between performer and instrument and a very quick response time on the side of the performer, which can probably be a lot of fun too. So we will hear once again the piece now with the score.
Thank you very much, of course, in first place for this wonderful performance and also for the analysis and your explanations. We have some minutes for questions and comments.
Thank you.
You can also ask in German. We both understand
I prefer in English.
Yeah.
Small question. When I heard the analysis or the proposition to make it a game, something else caught my attention. So I'm not really a big fan of new complexity, so I don't exactly know what they're saying themselves, but I had in mind another model all the time for new complexity that would be the equivalent of an athlete or a skateboarder, for example, meaning you're not playing with or against someone, except from yourself, and trying to really somehow, the skater for me is a good example. He's trying to do a kickflip, it doesn't work, he goes again, and it's no freedom, there's no expression. It's just about really going to a goal that is manageable or not, depending on the people, or in the case of scores, maybe never really actually possible, particularly, but trying to get as close as possible is actually the game. And what is the expression in the end is actually something that emerges from this very big, let's say, tragedy that happens inside of you from trying to make it perfectly. And so I don't know if that's a wrong way to see it, or how you imagine, or if it's not enough, maybe it's not funny at all for an interpreter to think like that. I don't know, I wanted to...
No, but I agree. That's also what I thought about new complexity. But having this challenge maybe try to think a little bit differently. And I always found, like I said, with new complexity, just the idea of defining it by your limits as just being a bit depressing. I don't know. But playing an instrument is anyway extremely technical, and we're always dividing ourselves by our limits and always trying to fight against our limits. But in this sense, I liked the idea of looking for a different kind of freedom and a different kind of expression in the score that wasn't just so technically based. But it's an interpretation. Also your analysis is an interpretation, no? Yeah.
But if I understand your interpretation correctly, you would also say that, the perfect rendering of the piece would still have this element of the filtering of the polyphony, which somehow means that, well, not everything is there, no? There is, what would a perfect rendering be, no? There would still be a piece which is full of holes, no? Full of absences, no? So I would say the idea of perfection somehow changes in this kind of piece, if the structure is really like this, no? As a kind of looking through a filter. Are there other comments?
I have just a question about the left hand. I saw a few harmonics, but especially at the end.
Yeah.
Does he use also, it's just normal pressure or harmonic pressure, or does it use also the transition between?
It's a transition. So if you look into the second to last bar, the bottom, the lowest note in the chord is like a half pressure, and then the second one is played normally, and then the third one is a oscillation between.
It's hard to see, but now I get it.
But of course, again, it's a question of muscles. So this hand is half pressing, this one is really pressing, and this one is oscillating between pressing and not pressing.
And at the end of the bar, you have a trill between half pressure and harmonic.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you again very, very much for this presentation.